One of the reasons that we thought it would be useful to have this webinar is because we often hear from programs telling us that they struggle in balancing results measurement together with their program implementation. And the fact is that it is intensive to do research properly, and that there is no magic to like zapping up figures and data. But at the same time, what we're also learning is that there are practical solutions that are emerging from the field that are taken towards increasing efficiency by using technology, using smarter research practices, using methods which are less paper heavy. So what we thought was that it would be useful to have this webinar to give a flavor of what is happening in the field, share with you some collected learnings, and on how to make results measurement more efficient. So firstly, Adam and I will start to share some tips on how you can do less in terms of results measurement, and also how you can do better. Passing on to you, Adam, now.
Thanks. Can you move the slide? Brilliant. Okay. So let's say you have an intervention to control flooding in the local area, and you've put in a drainage system, which is featured here in this picture. And you want to know if your intervention has led to a reduction in disease and an improvement in education in the local area. A quick question: do you need a big survey to show you this? Like, is it worth doing a household survey? Can you type yes or no into the chat box? You need to send it to everyone, or I won't be able to see it. Okay, got a few responses. Yeah, the point of this picture is that if your intervention isn't working, there's no point in spending a lot of money on results measurement. And like, this kind of works at different levels. If you are able to use good monitoring data to show you which interventions are having a result at the output level, you can save money by not spending, by not kind of working on big surveys at the outcome and impact level, because you know that they're not going to be doing much. Either the partner isn't responsive, or no one has taken up the service. No one has taken up the services. If your intervention is working at a small scale, let's say it's reaching 100 farmers, then you can ask, it might be worth a survey, but at least you should ask yourself, is there much point to it if it's not really contributing significantly to your targets? And this way you can save your kind of results measurement resources for the few interventions in your portfolio which are really working at a big scale and are having a big impact. Okay, now Vanessa.
I would also like to emphasize on this point that Adam makes on monitoring. I think the point is that the better you monitor interventions early on, the more you know and the less you need to find out through designing big and more expensive research. So I wanted to also emphasize this need for planning better. I think often what we see in the field is that programs tend to separate out results measurement from program implementation. As a result, outputs of both the systems are also kept separately. So I'll give you an example. If the intervention managers are managing an intervention, they're out in the field, they know a lot, they also have a better feel for what is working and what is not working. So when an assessment is coming up, if the RM team sits together with them, they can literally identify where the research gaps are. So they can use stuff which have already come in instead of going back to the same people with the same questions. For instance, you might just conclude that you have already enough information from the partner and there is no need to go to a partner. The other thing I wanted to specifically highlight is this thing about indicators. What we see in the field is that everyone loves indicators. It's easy to make, but of course, it's much more difficult to measure those indicators. So that's also an area where we feel that programs can be smarter in terms of defining less indicators. For example, I'll just give you an example. Say the change that you're trying to measure is that farmers get information from retailers. Now, the most important information over here, the most important indicators that you really need to know are whether what is the number of farmers who are getting this information, and of course the type of information they receive, whether that's linked to the work that you're doing. The good to have but not really essential is that what retailers feel that the farmers are asking, the farmers' opinion on what else is needed, the number of times the farmer visit retailers. So that's a place where you can be a bit smarter in terms of defining what is it that you need. I'll pass on to you now, Adam.
Right, having remembered to unmute myself. Thank you, Navneeta. Cool. So the next point is to, when it comes to doing less, try to reduce the complexity. Most MRM systems are quite complicated, and this isn't really surprising because you're trying to monitor. Ooh, can you hear me now? Okay, if there are any audio problems, let me know. Most MRM systems are quite complicated. You're trying to monitor complex things, and the process of doing so is quite difficult. But it's also true that many MRM systems are more complicated than they need to be, which adds additional confusion and wastes a lot of your team's time. So a couple of common sources of complexity are firstly duplication, and you often see duplication between documents. For example, every time you go on an assessment, you should ask why changes are happening or why they're not happening. So I've seen programs which carefully write down for every intervention monitoring plan, for every level in this monitoring plan, the question why. And this is just a duplication of something which you could write one time in your, let's say, a standard checklist for doing assessments, and then get people to refer to it whenever they go back to the field. A similar point is to keep documents short and simple. So in my last program, we had a limit of about 2 pages for interview reports, 5 pages for field assessment reports, and focused this kind of documentation, not on the blow-by-blow account of what was found out, but on the key 3 or 4 key learnings which came out of each thread. And this was a bit more effort to write, but it was a lot easier for people to read and kind of take on board, and made it a lot easier to kind of aggregate and get an overview of the different interventions. Back to you, Navneeta.
Yes. Just a quick reminder, everyone, while Adam and I speak, if there are any questions, please do feel free to use the chat box to send it to us. Another point that we wanted to make was in terms of simplifying methods of doing results measurement was that this thing about baseline. Now the question is, do we need baseline? The short answer is yes, of course we need to know in order to be able to measure whether we create change. But how you do it can again be done quite efficiently. For example, instead of doing separate baselines, which are done as separate studies, it might be more efficient to do it retrospectively if possible. For example, when you do your impact assessment or when you do your monitoring, can you do it later on where you can combine different researchers together? Also, often when you start a program, a lot of market research is done, which is not later used because it isn't specific enough. However, if you have access to the raw data, actually, you can use that data. For example, you can separate out the beneficiary group. You can isolate out certain information which you need, for example, general information relating to prices, costs, etc. So again, it goes back to this entire thing about planning. It's very important to first see what you have and then identify the gaps that you have. And the same applies to also secondary research. The other point I wanted to mention was about attribution. So before speaking about attribution, I wanted to share the following picture with you. So these are my 2 daughters. Last week I was busy with something and I came back to this. My elder daughter is 3.5 and my younger daughter is 1. Now, given that I know my elder daughter's expertise with lipstick and makeup, and the fact that she is holding the lipstick in her hand, I was reasonably convinced that it was my elder daughter who was responsible for the mess. It could have been my younger daughter, it could have been my husband, but I believe that I have sufficient evidence to actually make the call that it is my older daughter who made this mess. Not rock solid proof, The point I'm trying to make here is that when you want to do results measurement in a credible manner, think of what you need in order to convince a reasonable, skeptical observer. You don't need scientific proof in order to measure in a credible manner. Now, I have a question for you. In order to assess attribution, do you think it is always needed to have a compare your treatment group with a control group? If you could answer, okay, yeah, I am looking for a few more answers. If everybody can send the reply to everyone. Great. I think, yeah, we know the answer. The short answer towards it is that you do not always need a control group in order to establish attribution. There are other methods to do that. For example, you can do a before and after comparison. You can rely on in-depth interviews with different opinion leaders to verify responses. So in order to do results measurement simply, I guess the question to always ask is that now, what is the simplest method in order to convince a reasonably skeptical observer? I will now pass on to Adam again.
Okay, so we are also going to start with a quick poll. And can you look at the question on the screen, look at the picture, and tell me who that is using the codes 1, 2, 3, or 4. Good, except for Ben, who needs to work harder on his football knowledge. Everyone else? Oh, sorry, Julie. Most people seem to have got there. No one said it was Ronaldo, which is good. Only one person said it's Donald Duck. Okay, so the point of this picture is that this is Neymar, option 2, the most expensive footballer in the world at £200 million. You might not have as much money to spend on your MRM lead, so if you do, please get in touch. But it is still worth investing heavily in your team, especially at the beginning of your program. It will save you a lot of money later on. And there are 2 specific ways I wanted to talk about in which you should do this. The first way is to train the whole team, not just the results measurement team, but also the technical side and the managers. This is good practice anyway, because results measurement is everyone's responsibility. You may have heard that said before. And it also saves money because everyone is aware of what to look for on field visits, what indicators they should be measuring, and so on. A lot of the data you need can be gathered by the technical team on field visits, and this reduces the size and the kind of system of MRM you need around it. And the second point is to build in-house capacity to do research. In a lot of countries, you can find very cheap consultants who will do quite low quality research, and very expensive consultants who will deliver sometimes very good research. But in general, building your in-house capacity is a better way to do cost-effective research. I don't mean that your team should be actually going out to the field and asking questions to everyone. It's great to use enumerators, have like trusted networks of enumerators you can tap into. But if your team can set the questions, set the questionnaire, manage the data collection, and do the analysis, you could save a lot of money compared to hiring consultancy firms. All yours, Nabanisa.
Continuing from Adam's point on how to build in a good team, I think one of the important things is really investing in this good team. And how do you get about doing that? Now, one of the things that we see in the field is that it might be much more cost efficient to get a longer term support from one specific consultant instead of having different people coming in at different points of time to help the program, because then, you know, the person gets to know the program, so it's easier for that person to pick up. And it is more usually efficient then, like, initially in the beginning of the program, you can have that person come in a bit more frequently to understand the program and train people in-house, but later that could be phased out a bit more, where you can use that external support remotely. So for instance, if you have a question, you send it to that person. So this building in this long-term support with one or two specific consultants we've seen have been much more efficient than having different people at different points of time who don't, where you need to invest more in like explaining the same thing over and over again. The other thing I wanted to mention was this thing about like sometimes we have all these requirements as programs to do special studies, for instance, on disaster risk reduction, food security, poverty reduction, which are very specialized studies, and that can be done at one point of time. In terms of those studies, it's often much more useful and efficient to outsource it out, so that to a specialized team who knows, who has much more technical capacity in that. Or if it is really a donor requirement that's needed by the program, maybe you can also negotiate with the donor on whether they are willing to pay for the cost and manage it a bit better to make sure that it doesn't really also get in the way of program implementation. Now I will hand it again to Adam.
Okay, so this point is about mixed methods. And in the same way that a fruit salad is better than any single fruit, using a mixture of methods is better than any single method. And when I talk about mixture of methods, I mean mixing of both quantitative methods, like surveys, and qualitative methods, like focus group discussions or in-depth interviews. And by mixing both methods, you are able to avoid the limitations of both. Quantitative methods are good at getting, like quantifying change, saying how much some income has changed, and understanding how generalizable this change is. Qualitative methods are very good at understanding exactly what people mean when they say that something has changed and why they're saying it. If you're able to combine these methods well, then you should have more kind of reliable research, more confidence in what you're saying. You can also get by with a smaller sample size or without using some of the more complicated quasi-experimental control group-based techniques for assessing attribution that Nobonita was warning you about earlier.
Another place where we feel that you can improve, where programs can usually do research a bit better is, or more efficiently, is on sampling. There is often a perception that, say, for instance, if you work in 10 different districts of a country, you need to go visit all the countries and get a sample out of each. There is really no need to do that. I think like when we do results measurement, it's very important to be practical. So instead of like, instead of going to every district, it is possible to say pick out 2 which are needed. And here again, I need to stress on this importance of monitoring better, because when intervention managers are managing interventions, they often get a lot of information. They know where the intervention is working, where it's not working. So if they sit together and discuss better with the RM team together on like sampling, it again can be much more better to go, if there's 10 districts and we know that, this is a district where it works better and this is where it doesn't work that better, you can just pick 2 districts to go to understand, to get a feel for both the scenarios. And the next point that I wanted to make was about using modern technology. I just wanted to mention that this is something which I think we are hearing more and more programs are doing, using modern technology to increase efficiency. And actually, I won't spend much time on it because the next 2 presentations are going to give you a flavor of some tools that are being used in the field. Finally, I would like to also thank these consultants, Ali, Hans, and Picha, with whom we had extensive discussion on gathering these tips from the field on what people can do in order to increase efficiency. And now I will actually pass it on to Steve Morris and Mukuka from Zambia, Yapasa, who will share a specific example of how they've applied modern technology to increase their efficiency.
Okay, thanks Navanita. Nice introduction, and thanks for handing it over. So welcome to Zambia. I will just pass the screen over to our first time. So understanding the impact in real time. The YAPASA project, Youth in Agribusiness, YAPASA means it's succeeded, and it's all about getting young people into agricultural value chains through rural enterprise development. We're taking a market systems development approach, of course, and we're guided by the DCED standards. Maybe in the very early stages of the project, we were over-guided by the DCED standard and tried to do things so much by the book, but I'll come to that on the next slide. Thanks to CEDA, Swedish CEDA, for our funding, and thanks also to the lab in the ILO office in Geneva for some backstopping support. Okay, so searching for cost-effective MRM. Just a brief history of one of our interventions. We had work going on in soya outgrowing schemes, youth-inclusive outgrowing schemes. So in the 2014-15 season, we had 100 farmer outgrowing pilots, and we were very keen to do a rigorous impact assessment. We got a well-known international consultancy firm to do a baseline and an impact assessment, and it cost us a whopping $34,000. The information coming through from that, particularly the analysis, was very disappointing, actually, for that amount of money. The following year, 2015-16, we did our second wave as we expanded the pilot to 3 businesses with 511 farmers. And that year we decided to take an in-house data collection approach. We were doing early warning check survey interviews by the team members when they were on mission. We had detailed monitoring Excel sheets filled in by the partner companies. And it gave us lots and lots of information, but did use a lot of our staff time. In the 2016-17 season, our third wave, we've expanded to 9 businesses, reaching out to 1,800 farmers, and we went for a local, low-cost collection method. So we had our enumerators, the Alliance for Young Entrepreneurs, had 11 data collectors who we trained up in some methodology. And they did the they did the data collection, but we did the analysis of that data ourselves among the team. That one cost us a total of $10,000. And then last year, in our phase 1 extension, we moved to a slightly different intervention, getting away from the actual outgrow schemes to more to a last mile input distribution model. Working with 4 agro-dealers, 76 community agro-dealers, and selling to 3,000 plus farmers. And for this one, we introduced this mobile app and online app called Fast Feedback, which consists of 2 rounds of telephone interviews, which were conducted by AYE, the same data collectors who'd already been trained up by us. The information goes direct to a dashboard where we can monitor it in the office, and the total cost of this one is $8,000. So I think showing that from 100 farmer pilot at $34,000 to a 3,000 farmer pilot for $8,000 is quite good progress in cost effectiveness. There are challenges with traditional systems. If you're doing big surveys, it tends to be once after every season. But with fast feedback, it's rolling whenever you need it. We could do 3 or 4 interviews throughout the season and be able to change course accordingly. There's also the cost trade-off between the intervention cost and the MRM cost. So as I said, the big survey was very expensive for a small pilot. And the fast feedback is much cheaper for a large intervention. In terms of information presentation, I think Adam mentioned this also, traditional long survey reports with complicated Excel sheets takes a lot of time to wade through. Whereas fast feedback gives catchy information when it's needed on a dashboard. And then the information bias, where we were using the in-house team, perhaps it was too close to the respondents. These are farmers that we might be meeting on a regular basis, so it's good to have a bit more detachment. And the fast feedback methods with those AYE enumerators captures that. I think here I'll hand over to Mukuka, who will explain a bit about how the intervention itself works before explaining fast feedback.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So we have the last mile input distribution intervention, and we have the blue arrow showing product and information flow from the input suppliers. In this case, for us, it was MRI and a few other suppliers. So they supply to the agro-dealers, who then supply to farmers who are in the community, who we call community agro-dealers. And these community agro-dealers then sell off these inputs to the clientele, the target group, the farmers in the communities, the smallholder farmers. So then our fast feedback collects data from community agro-dealers and the target group, the client farmers. And this information is then collected by YAPASA and fed back to the input suppliers. This is done so that for basic, I think, proving of business case, to just show that there's a need for particular way of running your business, or how to approach the client farmers, or what their needs are. So basically, that is how the last mile input distribution works. And of course, the cash flow comes back through the agro-dealer to the input suppliers. So then with how the fast feedback model is working, we have a couple of participants, which is us, of course, YAPASA, who need the information. So we work with fast feedback, and of course the tool, which is the questionnaire, is usually downloaded is usually developed by us, and fast feedback sends it on to the surveyor, which in this case is, I think Steve already alluded to, AYE, Alliance for Youth Entrepreneurs, the people that we work with, who we have trained. Then they administer the questionnaire to the project participants, the farmers, over the phone. And this information then is brought back to fast feedback, and they put it onto a dashboard which we access, and the data information is then processed already. I don't think you take all the time you need, like it was mentioned before, Excel and reports, and so yeah, it's done by YAPASA. So that is basically how it works. So how is it helping? It's helping, first of all, to listen. Short surveys capture what people love, loathe, and want done differently. It doesn't take too much time. The farmer gets to go on with their business and so to you. And it's a short phone conversation that you can conduct over a couple of days, depending on the kind of information that you want. You can always return to it and so on and so forth. And learn. Dashboards make it easy for everyone to track value creation. There's this thing where information, or rather data management, is usually the MRM team's responsibility, but in this case, everybody, including the portfolio managers, gets to participate in it and just be a part of it and understand what is going on. The lift off action plans help prioritize ways to respond to feedback. So it's the action plans are developed from what you get as information, and if the information is narrowed down and targeting what exactly you need, it's easier to develop those action plans and inadvertently implement them. So because of all of this, there's low bias and the cost is significantly low. The burden on the team is low, and on the farmer as well, and the cost, of course, is definitely low.
Okay, thanks, Mukuka. And we also found a number of other benefits coming from this. I mentioned before the less contamination of data because it's done by a third party. Definitely time saving for the project implementers. The team have spent a lot less time collecting information and more time analyzing the information. It also gives us, quickly identifies issues for triangulation. So, for example, on the dashboards, we may see some comments coming through from farmers or community agro-dealers that throw up interesting questions that we would then want to check with the agro-dealers or with the input suppliers. And it also gives us early warning of potential valuable case studies. If there's a particular community agro-dealer that's maybe selling more than others, then we can go and do a bit more deeper interview with that community agro-dealer. Just a few snaps of how the dashboard looks. There's this satisfaction information called the Net Promoter Score. I believe from Market Share Associates who are doing this for us that 83 is a pretty good score. So it seems that things are going well with this intervention. We've also got views looking, say, this is one of the questions that's presented as a pie chart, and it gives us very easily identifiable reasons, in this case, for why farmers purchase from a community agro-dealer rather than going into town to the main agro-dealer. And then we get the farmer feedback dashboards, where if you see at the bottom there, there's emerging data which is coming out of the surveys. So we can click on different bits of that and get different perspectives. I did see a question coming in from one participant about the response rates. So in one district we had a much higher response rate than in another district, and this is reportedly because of poor connectivity. So a lot of the areas where those farmers had poor cell phone communication. So that may be something that occasionally needs to be borne in mind. Technology doesn't always help. I think with that, I'm going to hand over to Silvanus. I just need to hand over the ball to him. How do I do that? Cool. There's a lot of participants. Yes, please.
Sectors that are non-agricultural. We have a challenge in terms of measuring the size of the farms or the availability of data, and that's crucial for us in terms of classifying program participants and in terms of estimating crop yield. We also look at profitability analysis, and we all understand that self-reporting from farmers can be very unreliable, but it hasn't been a proof of how unreliable that is, the extent of unreliability. So we wanted to test that assumption, and we took a sample of some farmers, up to 229 farms established by 225 farmers, and we used a mix of approaches. We listened to the farmers, asked them to estimate what they think, how large their farms are, and then we did actual measurement using area distance and area measure. It's an open source app, and we cleaned up the data. It took about a day's level of effort to clean up the data, particularly looking at conversion, ensuring the units are uniform, and then we did analysis trying to compare the data from farmer self-reporting with actual measurements. We had some very interesting findings which are important for us in terms of looking at crop yields. Overall, we saw that these farms are relatively small. Up to 93% of the farmers that we interviewed reported farm size within 2 hectares. And we also saw a wide range, variance between the average size of farms from actual measurement and then the size from self-reporting. And we calculated that the difference is up to 70% of the GPS-generated data. we saw also a lot of over-reporting, and it's for two reasons. One is the fact that most farmers do not have a good sense of distance, so they are not able to estimate the size of the farms when asked how large their farms are. Then we saw also that some are estimating that deliberately, over-reporting deliberately, because in some countries, like in Nigeria, the financial institutions will usually link the size of your enterprise with the amount of loan you want to get from the bank. So in our own analysis, because of the relationship between the size of farmland and crop yield, we feel that inadvertently people will be under-reporting the crop yield, which also determines the additional income, and that an app like the distance and area measure may be a good alternative to self-reporting by farmers. Probably have some questions. I'm done with the presentation.
Thank you, Sylvanus, and thank you, Steve and Mukuka. It was very useful to have these examples. Right now, what we'll do is we'll go on to we've had a couple of questions that have come in when we took in the registrations, and of course, there's a lot of questions placed here. I'll start with one of the questions that came up during registration, and that question was, how can, given the market dynamics that you work with, especially in this private sector development where a lot depends on where things are dynamic and keeps on changing, how can someone predict and budget costs in a project setup when you don't know really what to expect? And to start this off, I think I will give the floor to Adam. Do you want to take a stab at answering that one?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it is one as a consultant we often get asked. And I think projects taking a market systems approach often struggle to budget because they don't know exactly what they're going to do at the start of the project. And this is worse for the MRM team because not only do you not know what your project is going to do, you also don't know what results it might or might not achieve. So I think the trick to budgeting is firstly to say, try and estimate how many interventions or whatever the kind of unit of analysis is, like projects or partners, whatever it is. Try and establish how many interventions will be very successful, slightly successful and unsuccessful, maybe 20%, 60%, 20% respectively. And then try and think through kind of a loose framework for what you would need for monitoring these different interventions. If it is very successful, would you have a big survey with a control group? Moderately successful, would you do a small survey? Unsuccessful, would you do focus group discussions or partner interviews or whatever? So this should give you your kind of field research budget. If you add in like the budget for the team needed to manage it, then I think you should be like on your way to a good budget.
Thanks, Adam. That's quite useful. We've had in a couple of questions specifically to the examples that we've had, and I thought we can start with that. Maybe start with Yapasa, and I'll throw this at you, Steve, and also Mukuku. Maybe a quick one first. Admir had a question on like what was the response rate like when you had these telephone interviews? Did you now get high responses or was it low?
Thanks, Amanita. The response was quite good. It was good. I was just explaining earlier to Steve that farmers are beginning to be they're not liking the face-to-face interviews anymore because I think there's a lot more projects that are doing it constantly and back-to-back, and I think they actually find the telephone interviews much easier to do other than compared to the face-to-face interviews. So yeah.
Okay.
Although,
and I think
we did find in one district the response rate was much lower, but that was just because the enumerators couldn't contact the farmers because of cell phone connectivity issues.
Okay, yeah. I think there's also, I think there's also a very interesting question also from Julie on this, because there are also limitations with technology. That I think what she's asking is that, like, perhaps these phone interviews work best for simple quantitative questions. So what kind of questions, what is now the limitations of this tool? What sort of questions do you ask? And I think to add to that, like, how do you now, are there any verification checks in place to check these?
In the version that we're using, the questionnaire is actually quite detailed and goes into quite a bit of information about how the farmers feel about things and how the community agro-dealers feel that they're finding running that enterprise. So it's actually quite a detailed and quite qualitative interview, as well as just collecting data. But I think maybe Julie is right that it lends itself more easily to quick information. But I think, as I pointed out in the presentation, the great benefit is that it can throw up some early indications of something happening that needs a bit more exploration, and that could be followed up the next time the team are on mission that way, visiting the farmers. They could do a bit more deeper face-to-face conversational, semi-structured interview, for example.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I guess let me just continue on the same round, because people had a lot of questions on this too. I think one of the questions was that can the responses be given by the beneficiaries themselves, or in other words, do you need to call them, or can they use the app themselves? And I guess also related to the same question, is it only can this only be administered through the phone, or can you do it some other way?
Okay. This is it's not an app as such. So this one is phone conversations for collecting the data. Although I have a feeling I'd have to check this with Fast Feedback themselves. I think they do have another version that can be done through tablets, where the enumerator puts the data directly into the tablet, and then it can upload directly onto the database. And I think we chose not to use that one because of internet connectivity in the districts where we're working. Phone connectivity is one thing, but internet is much more difficult. We did try in an earlier year. There was another piece of software called SenseMaker, which we didn't mention in this presentation, but that is more of a sort of guided, a self-answering questionnaire with a guidance from the enumerator. And it takes a lot of time, and there were lots of opportunities for misunderstanding or misinterpreting. It involved the enumerators guiding the respondent to move a ball into positions on a triangle. And I think we had quite a lot of difficulty with the information that was coming out of that one. So I think any app that is purely respondent useful would have to be very, very simple indeed.
Yeah. And how long did it take you, Steve, in order to make this, get this app ready, get this tool ready?
It's just a couple of weeks. I mean, we signed the contract, we drafted the questionnaire ourselves in team. I think they spent a day or so running through it with the enumerators, and then the whole survey was done over a period of a week or two. And with, as I said, the data comes in real time, so the very first interview appears there on the dashboard, and you see the answers changing as they come in.
Okay.
So very quick.
Okay. And there's another question I thought which was quite interesting from Vibe was, and the question was, how user-friendly is the program, like is the dashboard? So is it something which a non-IT person can also use? In other words, who in the program are using it, or is there a special team who needs to extract the data and put it in, and how is that done?
The dashboard itself is not very complicated. I don't think you need to be an expert at IT, for instance. As long as you're able to operate, like have basic computer skills, you're able to operate the dashboard.
Okay. Okay. I think we had another one. Okay, this one is for Sylvanus, you. We had a question on the on what. Actually, I'm not. Maybe this is something, Emeka, you can. Maybe I'll give it. I'll ask you to explain your question, because you said this was on the last presentation, and the question was any tips and tricks on dealing with issues of social desirability bias in using qualitative method. Do we have you, Emeka?
Yeah, I can comment on the question. Okay.
Hello. Yeah, we have you.
So it's regarding the first presentation about the mixed methods, combining quant and qual. So I was wondering, what has been your experience or a better strategy to deal with issues of bias? So respondents telling you the things that you want to hear and not the actual perceptions of these respondents with regard to their experiences, of being part of your intervention.
Okay, Sylvanus, you want to tackle that? Because I think this is something you and I also discussed quite a bit, and you felt that, that was really the problem, that farmers tend to really over-report on numbers. I mean, how do you, what is your experience in dealing with this problem?
Yeah, I explained just very briefly during the presentation that farmers tend to over-report so that they can give an impression that they have large enough farms to meet the requirement of financial institutions that will give them loans, or if there are access to credit projects or interventions, so that it meets that. So that's an issue in terms of bias, which I was saying the app is now an opportunity to be able to fact check.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Sylvanus is saying, Emeka, I think like this is something we, in the field, I think every program struggles with it. I personally have always found it very useful before going and doing an impact assessment, having a better feel for what sort of numbers I'm looking for. For instance, if I go to a field and a farmer tells me that his cotton production is so and so, at least in my mind, if I know that, this is really the range that it could be. So if somebody gives me a bizarre answer, at least I have that checkpoint. So I think that's where this thing about, like, we really emphasize on the fact that, like, if your monitoring is really good and strong, it helps you to be much more efficient in spending more on big researches later on. Because, if somebody gives you an answer which really looks dubious, you can question it a bit more easily if you know what you're looking for.
Can I add, Nabonita?
Yeah, Adam, go ahead.
Cool. I think it's a really good question, Emeka. In your question, you talked about social desirability bias in qualitative methods. And as the answers kind of came out, it seems often more of a bias in quantitative methods because you don't get the kind of interaction with the respondent. There are some, I think it's always going to be an issue. There are some common techniques to try and avoid it, using enumerators from the local area who are less of a distance to the respondent. Good facilitation from the data collector to put people at their ease. And I think one thing which is potentially worth trying, but I haven't seen very much, is to go back to the same person many times over a few months or a year and get to build up your relationship to the point where you're more likely to get honest answers.
Adam, I hope I can add to that. My experience last week when I went out for a small farm impact survey for aquaculture intervention, most farmers were actually complaining that they're sick and tired of having to sit down day after day or week after week, because there's several projects visiting them, and that they won't do the surveys anymore, the one-on-one key interviews. And they actually say they either won't do it anymore or they will charge to give information. So it's slowly beginning to become a problem.
Yeah, I think that's also something we see quite a lot, that like again, like I would still emphasize this point about planning better, because I've also seen that like in programs, like I used to work for a program in called Catalyst in Bangladesh, and there we often had this, like there were the same people were reached with so many interventions, and you kept on going to them separately for all the interventions. So you end up like somebody going like, I don't know, 3 times or 4 times a year. So I think planning is like, we often talk about that planning is something probably like, we need to spend a bit more effort on in order to be efficient and collect things at one go if possible. We also had, I thought that we had another question from Steve Hattridge so this is for Yapasa. Has the continuous feedback helped the project adapt the interventions? So I guess how useful has the tool been?
We haven't actually made any concrete adaptations as a result of the feedback. But what we have done, as I mentioned earlier, is to at least see some early signs of something that we want to look into a bit more deeply. And that would probably result in a change. Depending on what we find out. That level of interviewing is happening at the moment, I think. But certainly the improvement is that we know that this intervention started in May, June, and we had our first round of feedback in July already, late July, early August. Normally we wouldn't have got that until next year if we were doing a kind of end-line survey. So it does give us a great opportunity. It doesn't look as though we're going to have to change the model very much, but there are some issues that we are exploring more.
Okay. I think we have addressed most of the questions related to the specific ones. I think there's one question from one of the slides I presented from Onoman on the sampling, because I gave this example of like if your work is reaching 10 districts, and then you can go to 2 districts, maybe one which is doing well and one is not, which is not doing well. So the question was like, now does that give you enough information to understand it? I think the point that I was trying to make is that if you do your monitoring, and by monitoring what I mean is that when the intervention is going on, the intervention managers are often in the field, so they get a better idea of where it is working or where it isn't working. So I often think that these are some information you already have in-house. For instance, there might be this field that like, okay, out of the 10 districts, 6 are working really good and 4 not so good. So then maybe it's good to go to both of them, and then you get a reasonable idea about like how well it is working in the good district and how well it's not working in the other district, so that you can make a reasonable estimation of impact. Does that answer your question, Onoman? Maybe you can unmute yourself. Okay, great. I don't think, initially we thought we would also let the people who've called in to ask their questions, but I don't think we have that many.
No, we don't have anyone who's phoned in. Everyone's joined on their computer or their phone.
Okay.
So I think we're coming up to the hour. Maybe we, unless anyone's got a last-minute question or comment that they want to make. Gerald and, oh no, I'm looking. Fantastic, fantastic participation, great answers. Oh yes, Huntington is making a comment, but not a question, so everyone can see that. Big problem in rural areas of Kenya. I wish actually there was some way to get a handle on all the countries people are joining the webinar from, because I suspect it's very impressive. Anyway, let me thank everyone very much for joining, and in particular, of course, the presenters and moderators and speakers of the webinar. It's been a fantastic hour, very much appreciated. We'll certainly do one more in the rest of this year. So if you have a comment on a theme or an issue or a question or content that you would like to see us cover, please let us know. Any of us, and that would be very welcome, and we will advertise widely again later in the year when we next do a webinar, and similarly if you have any comment on improvements and so on. I see a couple of people have joined without the audio, so I hope they got something out of it. Most people mastered the technology within the hour, so congratulations on that. Thank you for joining, and see you next time. Goodbye for now.